Following is an astrological forecast for 2018. I hope you'll enjoy this collection of slides I've put together just to more fully illustrate visually some of the themes in store for us in the coming year. Last year, 2017, I referred to metaphorically as a blast-off year. It was a universal 1 when you add the numbers 2 plus 0 plus 1 plus 7 equals 10, or 1 plus 0 equals 1. And so 2017 was the beginning of a new 9-year cycle. And now in 2018, we're entering a 2, but actually it's very special because it's an 11-2. And 11 is a master number in numerology. It's the primary master number, and it can be described as the number of metaphysics and of awakening. So that's very exciting for us. When we look back in history in the 20th century, the 1900s, there was only one 11 year, and that was in 1901. In the new millennium, there's one every 9 years. It's rather exciting. So it's all part of the Aquarian age that's dawning. And so specifically to this year coming 2018, we're entering an 11-2 year, and it'll be very interesting to observe and pay attention to the themes that unfold, which are being indicated by the planetary alignments as well in various ways. Again, 11 being a master number is very much linked to an awakening consciousness, and it is linked to words like synchronicity, metaphysics, and spiritual mastery. When we refer to mastery with 11 and in numerology, it could be any kind of mastery, but it generally refers to, once again, metaphysics. So very exciting to consider. Now, the 1 year that 2017 was, I referred to as a rocket taking off, a blast off moment. And sure enough, looking back upon it, it was. The new president in the United States getting a lot of attention and shaking up the world in one way or another, and with mixed results, I think it's fair to say. But more specifically, it launched us into something of a new mini era, at least in light of this 9-year cycle we're in, which began last year. And so this year, the 11-2, I'm metaphorically referring to as the year we clear the exosphere, where the atmosphere and outer space meet. So, and then into the outer space, which in this respect, metaphorically, once again, represents a whole new dimension, a whole new mode of thinking and perspective that's coming about. Interestingly, though, as you'll see with the planetary alignments, there's some, well, as the case would be as often with astrology and with life, there's the pull to the traditional and there's the push to the future, and sometimes stronger in both directions. And this is true in the coming year. Now, just a bit of context for you to see the bigger picture and to remember this is the dawning of the age of Aquarius. There's a lot of information out there and has been for many, many years in our modern times. And there's still some confusion as to the exactitude of when it began, etc. But I just want to offer quickly that it began when the internet was born, basically. And we are in that dawning of the age. Now, you'll see here it's a 2160-year cycle. So when we say the dawning, it means there's a long way to go, centuries. We can discuss further, and I will in future presentations regarding the age of Aquarius, what was the midnight point. I'm going to leave that one to your imagination for now and just focus on the fact that the dawning process is here and has in fact occurred. The crack of dawn has certainly already occurred, and we're now in the sort of early morning of it. And all the rather revolutionary changes we're seeing is a reflection of that. So I'm saying this just to add a bit of big picture context for what we're going to see in terms of planetary alignments, etc., in the year coming. Now, the age of Aquarius can be basically described as giving birth to the global village, which we're seeing thanks to modern technology. We live in the modern era where we have technology, and science and technology has provided this for us, which is really wonderful and exciting in so many ways. At worst, though, it's led us to a materialistic consciousness in some respects where, there are various factions of society that maintain that. So we're hoping for, in this age, an awakening of a new spiritual realization. And this is where the 11 metaphysical number of 2018 comes to for example, and in other respects. So it's very, very important that we awaken to our spiritual nature, I would offer, as astrology strongly represents that theme. And it's not because of astrology, it's just that astrology does support that understanding. And it's in that it's not about religion, we're not talking about beliefs, we're talking about understanding and realization that we are souls incarnate, and we need to come to that realization and thereby resurrect what would be called spiritual science. Spiritual science doesn't have anything to do with believing. It has to do with understanding and practicing. Practicing has a lot of levels to it, but basically it manifests as a deep sense of recognition that each and every person in the world is a soul incarnate, and that engenders a lot of respect, and it also has implications in terms of our larger social decisions being made. And so it invites us all to have self-respect and to get on board with the social discussion and to make our contributions just in consciousness, just to be aware of being aware. Now, another big picture theme is reflected in the Uranus-Pluto cycle. Now, there's a lot of cycles in the big picture, but this is a very important one, and it began in 1965. I've written a fair amount of articles, and I'll put a link soon back into the newsletter, which illustrates that whole theme more fully. But basically, what occurred in the past several years was a Uranus-Pluto square, and that really activated in a very strong turning point sort of way the entire theme of that conjunction, which occurred in 1965. And I looked at it closely and I thought, this is going to produce a gender revolution. And sure enough, it has. And so in the past number of years, we've been seeing the rise of new consciousness with this gender equality. This is going to become a global theme, and as you just saw, it'll last until 2104. Now, what we're talking about is the entire cycle continues until 2104, and even though the Uranus-Pluto square, which lasted a few years, in fact, and had 9 contact points, 7 precise and 2 very, very close, even though it's over, it doesn't mean that the whole theme is over. Sometimes people assume that. No, it actually, in some respects, was just the beginning. That was the activation period. And so we're fully in it. And so while Jupiter was in Libra back in, starting in 2016 through to 2017, we saw the activation of justice in terms of the gender equality. A lot of women coming forward and making it known that they've experienced sexual abuse in inappropriate ways in years gone, prior. And so a lot of famous people have fallen to that recognition, have, been brought forward and to be accountable and so on. So that's going to continue. So Jupiter in Scorpio, which we'll get to in a moment, will transform global awareness and attitudes about that even more. All right. So, just a little commercial PS. I'm going to be teaching a 4-part astrology webinar starting in January, and it'll be 4 Sundays in a row, and it'll teach you all the basics of how to work with actually an astrological calendar, which is a very practical way of learning astrology, because you learn all the basics, but then you have a tool that you can use on a daily basis. So I hope you'll give consideration to joining me for that 4-part series, and it'll be, as I said, a webinar, and that week in between will give you a chance to reflect and digest and read the material that will be offered, etc. So more details on that coming, and if you're interested in this sooner than later, just send me an email and I'll add you to the list, and look forward to doing that for you in 2018. Now, the new year can be understood to have 3 beginnings. This is a symbolic perspective that's important to consider. First, we have winter solstice. Then it's the new moon in Capricorn. You see the new moon in Capricorn. Capricorn's what's called a cardinal sign. It represents new beginnings. There's a bit of a discrepancy, which I'm going to explain in a moment regarding that. We're going to focus on that in a moment. January 1st is also the third date. Now, most people focus on that one. It's understandable. But winter solstice can be understood as having the most spiritual and psychological power. So astrologically, we look at that day more even than January 1st, but we can do both. So winter solstice is what I refer to as nature's new year. It's that moment in time when in the tropical zodiac, the sun enters Capricorn and marks the day of the longest night or shortest hours of daylight, but it's also, more importantly, the beginning of a new cycle, an annual cycle of the sun increasing from that day on in its hours of daylight in the northern hemisphere, and then once it reaches summer solstice, it decreases. So these are very important factors in Western astrology in particular. Now, it just so happens that on winter solstice this year, the sun was exactly conjunct the Saturn. Saturn had just entered Capricorn on the 19th of December, and that's a very significant, almost 3-year cycle, which we'll be discussing more in the course of time, and I'll mention more about it in this presentation. The main point is whatever aspects are occurring on winter solstice exactly at the moment when the sun enters Capricorn represents a theme that will unfold over the course of the year. So the fact that the sun was exactly conjunct Saturn or vice versa is the main point. Now, when that does occur in one's natal chart, for example, it indicates a sober, sort of weighted attitude at worst, but it can at best produce a sense of duty, discipline, and maturity. But that depression, despair, cynicism theme that can come with Saturn and the weight of responsibility implies is an important one to be aware of so that you can offset it. Now, what was really exciting about that day also was Venus was conjunct the galactic center. Now, I've been writing about this in my newsletter, as most of you are probably aware, over the past couple of issues. And the first began with the Mercury-Saturn conjunction, Mercury retrograde at the time, which I'll explain in a moment. And then there was the new moon, which just so happens on the 18th of December to have been conjunct the galactic center. And then at the time of winter solstice, Venus was conjunct the galactic center. So the galactic center is getting a lot of attention these days, and rightly so. So it's not just some passing trend and fad consciousness. You see, once again, these alignments, these conjunctions mark the beginning of cycles. And in particular, Mercury-Saturn, when Mercury was retrograde there on the back on the 14th of December, that day produced a new cycle that we're still in. And no, sorry, that wasn't the 14th. That was Anyway, the main point is that earlier in the month, just retracing my memory on that, exactly the day. But the main point is that that activated what I interpret to be a 29.5-year cycle, because Saturn takes that long to return to that point. But the fact that Mercury was exactly conjunct Saturn at the time was what gave it extra distinction. So that's the point there. Now, it should be noted that Saturn in Capricorn, which extends from December 19th, 2017 to December 17th, 2020, is in its own signs. Saturn rules Capricorn, and that is in astrology considered an honorable placement for a planet to be. So while Saturn is a heavyweight in astrology and in life, the planet of the sum total of one's karma in one's chart, for example, and always producing weight, a sense of delay or pressure to perform in a responsible way, So it's got something of a reputation of being a heavyweight, very sober and disciplined, and with a sense of authority coming from the external often. But it should be noted that it is in honor in its own sign, and that's where we get this notion of the lofty peaks. Capricorn very much represents the lofty peaks that we all are destined to aspire to rise to in our own way, at our own pace, in our own evolutionary journey. It's not about comparison, and we should all be, as driven and hard working and dry, so forth as others. Some are naturally and some aren't. So we all have our own mountains to climb, but the ideal is that we, in our own personal way, do climb those and achieve greater heights in the course of our life. Now, this is a chart. This is the only chart I'm going to show you today with winter solstice here. And now what I wanted to show you was that Sun entering Capricorn conjunct Saturn. See that 0-0? That's very important to note. That's a very powerful conjunction, very close. Now there's Venus. Venus is at 2533. The galactic center is just over 27 degrees Sag, so we call that within orb. Especially when it's within a couple of degrees, it was considered conjunct. It's not exact, but it's close enough to feel the heat and the influence very much. It's interesting to note that Mercury is still retrograde there, and in Sagittarius, which I've explained in my previous newsletters, can be described as the mark of the lost soul at worst. It does, in the positive sense, when well aspected in one's chart, produce a strong philosophical mindset, so it should never be interpreted in a pat way. It always depends on the whole chart. But it does have that lost soul principle in it, because Mercury is in its detriment when in Sagittarius, it so happens, which means it's in a challenged sign position. And the retrograde adds to that factor. Now, it is worth noting that with Venus here in Sag, it's ruled by Jupiter. So Jupiter conjunct Mars in this chart, which is cast for Greenwich. We do that just because we have to find a global place in the world to create a chart. And this is what's called an equal house chart. So we're not going to worry too much about longitude and latitude, except that it's at the 0 of the west longitude. You'll see that if you look very closely here, it's Greenwich just so happens to be at 0000 west. So it's the beginning of the longitudinal line division of the planet. The main point here is that this chart here represents a theme of 2018 because it's winter solstice. And what you're seeing is what's called a bold chart. Mars up here at 7 Scorpio, Uranus down here at 24 Aries. You'll see all the planets are on this side except for the North Node. Now, with the solar chart, the North Node ends up in the 8th house of Scorpio, and Mars and Jupiter are in the 11th house, but in the sign of Scorpio. Mars in Scorpio on its own is very revolutionary. So it's indicating that we're entering very revolutionary transformational times. And these are linked in part to that galactic center theme, which once again is, in its most positive sense, an activation and awakening of a search for our spiritual heritage, for our spiritual nature. Saturn in Capricorn is very authoritative and disciplined and sober, yes, but it's also very traditional. Now, when we look at history, etc., we think about tradition, we go back in history, we realize that many of our more materialistic mindsets are very modern. The ancients, most by and large, believed in higher realities, and they certainly gave a lot of credence to, whether they called them the gods, which in modern language and astrology would be called the archetypes. And there's a whole new interpretation, but the basic point is that there was reverence for higher power and the understanding that was more to life than the empirical mind could see. So that's the indication that we're entering a time which is going to lead us to reconsider our, current popular considerations and opinions about how reality is, and reducing it to the material is directly contradictory to how and why astrology works, by the way, which is based on a metaphysical model and which indicates a multidimensional universe, and we as souls incarnate in participation on the earth plane, what would be otherwise called the earth school. There's lots to say about this chart, but keeping it short, the Scorpio factor, Mars and Jupiter high in the chart, and the North Node in the house of Scorpio helps a lot to give us an indication. The moon in Aquarius as well is worth noting, adds to that because it's about itself awakening, and it too, Aquarius, is very much linked to metaphysics. 11, as I mentioned, is the metaphysical master number, and it's linked in its own way to the 11th sign and house in astrology, which is Aquarius. So we have a theme running there. Now, the new moon in Capricorn, by the way, occurs on January 16th, 2018. So that will produce a very important activation for us all in its own way, and it's true to say. However, I want to mention that the new moon in Sagittarius conjunct the galactic center, which occurred on December 18th, 2017, comes in very close to challenge that traditional, it just so happens, there you go, that's Aquarius for you. It's challenging the traditional perspective because, you see, it just so happens that it was conjunct the 0-degree Capricorn point. December 18th, 2017 is about 27.5 degrees of Sagittarius, which puts it in within orb of conjunction to 0 degrees Capricorn. So it just so happens that this year it's an exception of sorts to the rule because the new moon happens so closely to the solstice point, 0 degrees Capricorn, that it in its own way is qualifying as the new moon that's launching the year. And the fact that it was in Sagittarius, the philosophical sign, and visionary, seeking higher ethics and truths, etc., and once again, conjunct the galactic center. Just to clarify there, and I did mention this in my recent newsletter, is that the galactic center is a very spiritual point in astrology, and it bears out in practice when we observe that. Now, so Saturn conjunct the Mercury retrograde and the galactic center occurred on December 6th. There you go. That's the date I was after. And it's a rare alignment. And when you have Saturn conjunct Mercury, it creates a very insightful kind of energy at best. And again, at worst, Mercury retrograde in Sagittarius indicates the lost soul. So the basic takeaway and interpretation I'm offering is that humanity must reclaim its soul. In the scientific mindset, etc., the materialistic especially, not just science. It's more of the materialism. When we say materialism, we're talking about the consideration that everything's just random and arbitrary and there's no real rhyme or reason to it all. It's just chance, and we reduce life to a materialistic mire at worst. And this is dangerous for us all, really. It's dangerous in every single way. It's the beginning of a fascist mindset. There's no accountability. There's no reason to really care. There's no deep sense of compassion, empathy. All of that type of thinking goes away. It becomes sort of a pragmatic rationalization mindset at worst. So those are my thoughts on that. Now, January 1st is the classical day we mark the new year, and it still remains true. I call it it's the official day, but it's the linear, the Saturnian perspective. The Saturnian mindset is all about time, and it's very much tradition, and it's mainstream consciousness. So January 1st at midnight, it corresponds to what can be called the social or the legal factor regarding the year. It has its own power. We could look at that date to indicate what might be unfolding for the year, but it's not the natural. It's an artificial kind of construct. So it's important to give that some consideration, even though it remains a good and fun day to, celebrate New Year's on. It doesn't have that deeper psycho-spiritual theme that the winter solstice point does. Okay, so that's the main point. Now, in 2018, there'll be 3 solar eclipses. It's rather exciting. The first one will occur on February 15th. At 27 Aquarius 08. So if you have any planets or angles within the about few degrees either side of that sign degree, 27. So if you have 24 Aquarius or 1 degree Pisces even, you would be influenced, and that would be true of all the other signs. So any planet or angle at 24 to 1 degree will have a feel of that eclipse. But the closer, the stronger, of course. If you happen to be born February 15th, well, you're going to really get a strong boost of it, and it's a destined theme. So eclipses, solar eclipses are very much activations of new themes of destiny, and they're very strong. And definitely will produce big effects if you have planets close to that degree, or if you happen to be born on that day, and so on. So the next one's on July 12th, and it's at 20 Cancer 41, same principle. And the third one, August 11th, 18 Leo 42. So that's where one of the factors of predictive astrology is to pay attention to that and see if and when or where and how the eclipse, the solar eclipses, will affect your chart. Therefore, by destiny, is scheduled to activate some, rather a big change of sorts in your life. Now, I say of sorts because it's not pat as to what exactly it'll do. You always have to judge every chart on its own ground. So it just so happens it's going to happen during the Perseids meteor shower, which happens every year on the 11th of August. Now, there's 2 lunar eclipses in 2018 as well. There's usually a lunar eclipse accompanying a solar eclipse, not always, but often. Now, what's interesting is all the solar eclipses are partial, but the lunar eclipses are total, both of them. That's really rather exciting. It's said that the solar eclipses have a way of bringing what was in store all the while. Lunar eclipses have a way of bringing the future forward as well. They kind of, the moon eclipses the sun. So the sun represents the present and the moon is the past. So there's a sort of bringing forward the future more quickly. So it has an acceleration principle. So January 31st, 11 Leo, that's interesting, and July 27th for Aquarius 45. So same principle. When you have planets or angles within close orb to those, then you're going to feel it, and it all depends. You have to look at the whole chart to decipher what exactly it's going to do. Horoscopes will offer bits and pieces of insight, so they're worth watching for. But if you really want the true story, you have to get your astrology chart done with an astrologer like myself. Now, Mercury retrograde in Aries will occur this year. There'll be 3, as is generally the case. The first one in Aries, March 22nd to April 15th, in Leo, July 26th to August 19th, in Sagittarius, Scorpio, because it will start in Sagittarius and retreat back into Scorpio over that 21-day period, approximately November 16th to December 6th. So that's just a bit of a heads up on Mercury retrograde, which is, there's 3 of them annually, and it's not that big a deal. What is worth mentioning, though, is that while Mercury takes 88 days to orbit the sun, due to the retrograde periods over the course of the year, it actually takes an entire year to, go around the zodiac. So it's a little bit of a point that I'll make briefly, but there's more to say about that at another time. Now, the part of the big story this year is now Jupiter, Saturn, Chiron, and Uranus entering new signs. Now, Jupiter already entered Scorpio. It has only a 1-year cycle through each sign, so it's not that huge a deal, but it's significant to pay attention to what sign it's in. And it's in Scorpio, and Scorpio's a deep and powerful and enigmatic sign, and it produces change and transformation, death and rebirth, and all those powerful things. So Scorpio, and in its association with Pluto, can be said to uncover things, to bring things to the surface. It's the investigator, the inspector, the researcher, wants to bring things to the surface. So since Jupiter has been in Scorpio, as I mentioned earlier, we've been seeing a lot of, whistleblowing, especially in terms of sexual inappropriateness and abuse over the decades back. So that's really showing a trend there. Saturn in Capricorn once again, and will be for the next few years. Chiron will enter Aries. It's been in Pisces and it still is for some years now, and about 5, and will enter into Aries, which is very exciting because Aries in any case is the first sign of the zodiac. Any time a planet enters Aries, it marks the beginning of something very significant. Uranus is it's in Aries and has been since 2011, and now will enter into Taurus in April, which I'll elaborate right here. So Jupiter in Scorpio, October 10th, 2017 to November 8th, 2018. Jupiter, whatever it touches, it sort of increases, it expands, it inflates. And Scorpio, once again, strips, purges, purifies, transforms. Once it does its work to discover what it is, it goes to work to clean it out and to purify it, to bring it to the surface so it can be recognized and dealt with, we might say. Now, Jupiter in Scorpio will be trine Neptune in Pisces in 2018. That's a very wonderful, beautiful aspect that only happens, once every, 12 or 13 years, really. So that is something for us to really celebrate in terms of a spiritual renaissance theme, a mini renaissance, you might say. So it can produce new realizations, and it's likely that those who are destined to, who are here to, participate in the awakening and help people realize, guess what? Your soul incarnate, and you're a multidimensional being living in a multidimensional universe. But it still means, that's important. Just know that. But you still have a physical body, and you still have to play the Saturnian game. You have to be perhaps not of the world, but in it. And you have, bills to pay, and you have a life to live, and there's all the joys of that, but also the struggles. So it's not about dismissal of those responsibilities, but it does increase our joy factor, in fact, because we go with the realization there's more to it than just a material consumer mire at worst. Now, Jupiter will, in the course of the year, before the year's over, enter its own sign, Sagittarius. So that's rather interesting and exciting, because Capricorn will be in its own sign then, but only starting on November 8th, 2018, and through to early December 2019, Jupiter will be in its own sign, Sagittarius. More on that later, but that's exciting to note before the year is over. And Jupiter in its own sign is very interesting. It only happens once again every 12 years. And so it will really increase that whole theme. And Sagittarius is all about truth and ethics, which I'll explain here with the centaur, the archer, which in fact, it's understood that the archer aims the arrow at the galactic center once again. So this really comes back again. So the high ideal of spiritual realization and the ethical goal of truth and greater life accessible to all can be described as the Sagittarian ideal. And the downside is religious fundamentalism and fanaticism, which we all unfortunately see all too often. And it's hard for people to realize that their subjective program is just that. They're assuming they're seeing life as it is. We do not see life as it is. We see life as we are conditioned, as we are programmed. That doesn't mean we don't have any objectivity. It just means our objectivity is strongly colored by our subjectivity, our conditioning, our programming, our experiences, what we're exposed to. So until one comes to that realization, it's sort of the notion of sleeping spiritually is that you think you see life as it is. But awakening, ironically, is when you realize that you don't see life as it is, you see life as you are. And then when you realize that, you awaken to that subjective projection factor. When you understand that, then you come to a new place of seeing that, of course, my perspectives are colored, and in fact, it increases your objectivity. So it's a nice little play on things, that by being aware that you don't see things the way they are, but as you are, your objectivity increases. Then you begin to see them as they are, which also breeds, respect for other people's perspectives and interpretations in the highest sense, which is the contrary of fundamentalist, fanatical, religious attitudes and in other branches. Fundamentalism can branch into any area of life, not just religion, but that's where it tends to have the most oppressive power. Chiron in Pisces has been there since February of 2011, and Chiron in Pisces will remain there until April 17th, 2018. Now, Chiron in Pisces is not so well placed. It's sort of washed out, shall we say. It doesn't have its full ability. It's sort of on a retreat. It's not terrible, but it's not in its power. So when Chiron enters Aries, it takes on a whole new level of power, a whole new beginning. Aries, once again, the first sign of the zodiac, represents that. So April 17th, 2018 to April 14th, 2027, that's a long time in Aries. Wow. And basically, Aries is the sign of authentic self. So when in Aries can be described as the search for identity. Who am I? Why am I here? The authentic self. And that coincides really well with that whole theme of the planets conjunct the galactic center. And so it's very exciting in the highest sense. I interpret the whole theme of zombies in all the movies to indicate that sleeping consciousness. Now, Chiron in Aries square Saturn in Capricorn is one of the big aspects of the year. There's a lot of aspects. We're not going to cover all of them in this presentation. There's many that occur over the course of the year, really. So you have to, be selective. But Chiron square Saturn, Chiron in Aries square Saturn in Capricorn is a big one. And I'm depicting it, somewhat in a symbolic way as the Hunger Games. Now, all this is the spiritual warrior principle here, and in the background is the established authority that sort of mindlessly follows a sort of a dictatorial mindset, and it's very, again, pragmatic and rationalizing and cold, and people are no longer souls, they're just numbers. So the whole theme of the spiritual warrior to assert that we're not just numbers, we're not just things, we're not just to be toyed with. But historically, the abuse of power is nothing new. It's very old, and historically it's always been there. And so this is part of the Aquarian age where we need to stand up and establish our democracy, but based on a spiritual as opposed to a religious mindset is the message I'm sending. And that's connected to this whole theme of Chiron and Aries, and especially as it squares Saturn, so that it cross purposes. So it's going to really spark a spiritual revolution, I'm quite sure. But a spiritual revolution is not a religious war. Let's be clear on that again. It's more of an internal and more of an integral process. There's no, joining in a mob mentality with it. Now, Chiron retrograde re-enters Pisces in September, by the way, and will remain there until February of 2019. So just what happens with far planets when they retrograde, they can retreat back into the previous sign. So we're going to get that initial spark of it, Chiron in Aries. But then, we'll get the ignition, but then the period during autumn through to almost spring 2019 will be sort of a retreat. So it could, while it'll be happening, it'll happen perhaps more below the surface for a while. Now, Uranus in Taurus, May 16th, 2018 to April 26th, 2026, is major. This is a major, important 7-year or almost 7.5-year cycle here, 8 almost actually. There it is, 8-year cycle, in fact. And now I use the metaphor of a bulldozer or a tank for Uranus in Taurus. Now those are just some. It doesn't have to be seen as negative. This would be a very constructive theme of a bulldozer. This, of course, is not so constructive. It's more destructive. So, but it's, Uranus is a shaker principle, and Taurus, the bull, gives you that idea. We shouldn't just think of Taurus as a cow. It's sort of a passive, principle. It's more like a bull. It's very a force to reckon with. So it's a mover and shaker principle. Now, Uranus retrograde re-enters Aries in November, as is with Chiron in Aries. Going back into Pisces, and will remain there to March the 6th. So similar over the course of 2018, we're going to have these major players retreating back into the signs previously, and those periods just create an opportunity at best to just digest what has been initiated, and it puts things on a bit of pause, but it also builds energy, is a way of looking at it. So it comes charging back once it re-enters again. And then when it does the second time, it's there for good. So it really starts to come with a force. The first entry is very activating for sure, but the greater force is when it's in there fully and finally for its whole cyclic journey. So Uranus in Taurus is a mover and a shaker energy. And among other things, while Uranus has been in Aries, in my interpretation, it's really fostered a lot of the mindset in the back rooms of, the robotics age that we're in and entering now. And there's been a lot of talk that there's going to be more and more robots coming into the marketplace. And we're seeing that, and already even AI is really moving so quickly that it's outdistanced even the creators. And it's very scary at worst, that we're dealing with technology that is, out maneuvering us. And this is where we get this idea, the Terminator. That theme is some clever and aware people thought about this some time ago, that we have to be very, very careful just, with our technology. Just because we can do it doesn't mean we should do it. This is where we come back to the spiritual considerations. So, what we need to do is awaken to our spiritual natures and work with our technology simultaneously. And it's also with our spiritual nature to establish our essential dignity. So with everything you've heard today, I'm speaking at kind of two levels. One is the larger picture for us all theme, the human condition. And the other one is on a more personal level. How might these planetary movements, transits, and so forth affect you and all the eclipses, etc.? How will they be triggering your life? Where are you at in your life? What's going on? What represents themes of your destiny? And, I can help you understand that better and know where you're at in time and how to navigate through these, interesting times we're in, and perhaps to even inspire you to a larger vision of your life and purpose. Simply living and surviving and just having your creature comforts met is fine and valid and so forth. But when we live with a deeper sense of purpose, we also live with a deeper sense of passion and, a deeper sense of presence and so on. So that's part of the whole theme of awakening as well. Now, a final note is once again the 4-part webinar starting in late January 21st through February 11th. It's a type of learning of astrology, once again, which is if all you learn is this level of astrology in your life, how to read and follow effectively an astrological calendar, you'll have learned a lot. A lot of them are out for sale on the market, but a lot of people don't know how to use them well. It's just they gloss over it. And, it's a lot of people do learn from it, it's true. But if you can be walked through and really able to understand the details and the implications of how to work with it, wow, you'll be quite surprised, and the practical benefits are really great. You can really know when and when not, and you can also come to understand your own cycles better. It's like its own form of awakening. So there you go. Hopefully I'll be working with some of you in the new year, and look forward to that with that course. And of course, more newsletters will be following. And so thank you very much for your time. I hope you enjoyed what I shared with you today, and have yourself a Merry Christmas and a wonderful New Year, and all the best in 2018. All right, thank you.